But when you plant a bench graft, say out in the nursery row, you cover up everything. In fact, you even cover the top bud, and you let the shoot come up through the soil, or in our case, where we use a mixture of primarily wood shavings, because our soil crusts over. We use wood shavings, and therefore it doesn't crust. It comes up through here. But wherever you have moisture, any place on a grapevine like that, it will throw roots. Well, as long as this happens to be, say, a cutting on its own roots, there's no problem. But if it's a cutting on a budded vine or a grafted vine, in this case, here's your union right here, it will throw these sign roots. Now, in the nursery row, before we had this modern technique of going into a greenhouse, these sign roots were very helpful to support this little sign when it was growing until you got a union. Actually across here until you got a cambium form and it started operating. Then the rootstock would gradually start taking over, provided these were removed. As long as these sign roots remain, they are going to grow faster than the rootstock, so the rootstock gradually gets weaker and weaker. So generally in July, here in Davis area, where you've got bench grafts, the common practice is to uncover and cut these sign roots, and then your rootstock takes over. Now, it all depends for how long the bench graft has been growing on these things as to how much of a wilt that you get when you cut these roots. If you got big roots like this and you cut them, you can come back and half an hour later and this little old green shoot tip is just like that. It's laying right over. And by the end of the day, it's back in position again, if it's not growing strictly on sign roots alone. But if it's been growing strictly on sign roots, why, within an hour after you cut these, this thing is it's a green shoot tip. It's just over like that and never recovers. So in other words, you can tell pretty readily how severe a sign root condition you have by the rate of recovery of these things after you cut them. But this is a good example of what sign roots can do. Now, out there, in the last labs you've had, you saw those bench grafts, which two of the labs had the opportunity to uncover. And you still had sign roots because when we planted the rooting, we mounted up high, so wherever it's moist, you get new sign roots started. So sign roots are very undesirable, say, where you have a dormant bench graft or you're planting a bench graft, and you start getting these things. If you don't cut them, then this rootstock gets progressively weaker. But I just wanted to show this to you. Now, this morning, we're going to start in with a condition known as compatibility, particularly with bench grafting. Compatibility, what we mean by it, is a sort of an affinity between the scion and the rootstock. It's this, in other words, it's a genetic relationship that determines how well these two can exist and grow together. On a poor compatibility, you might have a graft where it'll grow for the first year, and then the top will then die out, and that's the end of it. In most of our vineyards here, our compatibility with the rootstock and scion combinations that we do use is very good. There's no problem. We find more of this in Europe, and I'll give you examples of it. If you have a real good compatibility, the vine will grow just as though it's growing on its own roots. There's no problem at all, and sometimes you'll have a very little difference in size right there at the graft union. Where the compatibility is not too good, and I think I've shown this to the labs, you'll have a top like this, and then it'll come down just like this. In other words, this is your scion variety. Could be Cabernet Sauvignon. This could be your St. George rootstock. And this is what you'll find in most of our combinations where you use St. George. You'll have, your stock will be much smaller in diameter than your scion. The compatibility is still good, but it's one of these cases where you get this existing condition. Now, there are different degrees of this compatibility. And the first case would be where you have the variety on itself. Now, this is a rather ridiculous. In other words, a variety on the same variety. And you might say Thompson seedless on Thompson seedless. You might say that should be perfect compatibility or perfect affinity. There shouldn't be any overgrowth of your stock. It should be ideal because your genetic constitution is exactly the same on these two. So in other words, this is almost, it should be the same as a cutting, actually, because your compatibility is perfection there. The second case would be one variety on another variety. And, in other words, we could say Kerrigan. Let me start over here. Let's say white Riesling on Kerrigan. I'm drawing a slash line here, meaning it's on Kerrigan. This would be the bottom. I don't want to go the other way because Kerrigan is a less desirable variety. So if a person's going to graft over a vineyard of a producing variety, Kerrigan, Palomino, or something else, to a better variety, he'd put something better on it. But this is a case of one variety on another. They're both in the same species. They're both vinifera, and you still have a good compatibility there. You don't have much problem. And then in the third case, has everybody got this here? Can I take this off?
Wait a minute, let me just interrupt. I want to say that we're going to be in these two rooms, and just to avoid confusion, let's put the A to I's, the A to I group in 109.
That's right over here, yeah.
That'll take a third of the class over there, then the other 2/3 will be coming here. So,
okay. Now, the third case of compatibility would be one species on another. And we're talking here, let's say, Vitis rupestris. Let me get this straight. And we're still going to use Vitis rupestris, but we're going to say Vitis vinifera on Vitis rupestris. And what's a good case of that? Well, let's go to Cabernet. And if that was on, let's say, St. George, rupestris St. George, you'd have a good example of that. Now, I showed you exactly what happens when you put them on St. George. You generally have an overgrowth of the fruiting variety, Cabernet, white Riesling, whichever one you use, on the St. George rootstock. This is not quite so drastic when you're using, say, AXR number 1. And this is a case here. This is a vinifera rupestris hybrid. But in other words, here's a case. Let's say a vinifera on a rupestris. You can use Cabernet. You can use Kerrigan, almost any of the varieties that we use on St. George. There hasn't been any problems at all. In other words, the affinity or the compatibility is very good. Now let's get a little worse condition. We can go a little further. Well, there are a few exceptions, though. In other words, where I'm talking here. Now we're going to find these mostly in Europe. And in Europe, they will have, like Kerrigan or Alicante, on 57R. In other words, Richter 57, and that is a Verlandieri. Rupestris hybrid. And that one there is okay. In other words, these combinations are okay. But when you get to, say, Emperor or Red Malaga, Palomino, this combination is out. In other words, it'll last for a few years, and then it goes out. It's not a good compatible combination, even though, again, we're talking vinifera on another species or a combination species. And Professor Jacob, back in 42, found that Black Corinth Merlot on 420A, that's another one of these European stocks that we don't use. It's another Berlandieri riparia. Was no good, didn't work. And then we can go with another combination. You all know about this one, vinifera on rotundifolia. In other words, any of our fruiting varieties in rotundifolia don't work at all, and that's a good case there where you got too many chromosomes in one that can't line up with the chromosomes on the other. So in other words, that's almost an impossible combination to make. So now we've covered several examples here where the two species, they will work in some cases, they will not work in other cases. And as far as our California viticulture is concerned, we are not disturbed with these problems. They are disturbed with the problems in Europe because they're using a little more complicated rootstocks than we are. Let's go a little further now. Let's go to a fourth example of where we have a genus on a different genus. In other words, we're talking Vitis now. Vitis is a genus or the genera. Well, when grape, we don't have any examples. Most of them don't work. The only example I can give you now, I'm going to have to go into the tree family, and we have the ordinary sweet orange, Citrus sinensis, which is your sweet orange, on Cyrus trifoliata, which is your trifoliate, and it is used as a rootstock here. And this is a combination that is compatible. This is good. We have another combination, especially with our deciduous trees. We have our pear, which is, that's the old one. Pyrus communis on quince, and that is Cydonia Oblonga. In other words, we have, this is one genus here, and this is one genus here. So in other words, those are two compatible combinations. These are good. Well, it all depends who the botanist is and who's doing the classifying, because way back when, they also used to call this one a Pyrus Cydonia. So in other words, depending on the botanist, there is a rather close relationship between quince and pear. So it is a good compatible combination. But in grape, we generally cannot go beyond the two different species classification. Now actually in a graft, there is no actual exchange of characters. If you were to, say, graft a muscat on your rootstock and then later on graft a Cabernet or white Riesling on that muscat variety, the muscat flavor would not go up into the Cabernet. In other words, whatever entity is on there remains itself. There's no change in any of the characters. We can modify some of the characters. We can modify the time of maturity. We can modify the color, especially in fruiting varieties. But as far as, say, changing the flavor where you have a rootstock or where you have a fruiting variety and then you graft something else on top of it, but this is not going to change at all. Once you get above that graft union, whatever is above there, that's what is going to remain.
Well, if you modify maturity and color, why do you suppose you can't modify flavor?
The flavor, in other words, this is an environmental change. It is not a genetic change. You can modify the environment, which you know, you plant grapes in one area, it's not going to mature at the same time as in a warmer area. So we're modifying the environment. Environmental changes you can modify, genetic changes we cannot. So in other words, we can change the degree of color, we can change the date of maturity, we can change a compactness of your cluster. Things like this, these are environmental changes, and you can change this by, say, using a different rootstock. Or you can take a weak sign variety, and you can put it on a vigorous rootstock, and you can increase the size of that vine, make it much bigger. Theoretically, it should hold more fruit. And this would be an environmental change, but it's primarily a more vigorous rootstock, but it's still not going to change the flavor of that fruiting variety. It will change the time of maturity of it. It might change the shape of the cluster, but it's still going to, if you got Cabernet, it's still going to be black, it's still going to have a certain type of berries and certain type of a cluster shape. And it's going to have a certain character in the flavor. This you will not change. This is genetic. But you will change the size of the vine, you'll change somewhat the shape of the cluster, somewhat the shape of the berries, and you'll change the time of maturity.
Are you saying that none of the components of flavor are environmental factors?
No, no. In other words, the flavor itself will not change. It's only the rate of growth, somewhat the size, slightly on the shape of the berries. But in other words, they'll still have the same original size. The seeds will not change. None of this will change. Possibly the color, which is affected by your rate of growth. You might cause later maturity or earlier maturity. If it's later maturity, the color won't be as good.
You won't change the basic varietal character.
No, 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 no. You'll change.
You can change the subtleties of the flavor.
Maybe because of more vigor. If you're on a vigorous rootstock, maybe the character won't be as strong. Because, in other words, presumably if you have a heavier crop and you have X number of leaves, they can only produce so much character in there. And with a heavier crop, you might change the amount of flavor in there.
What about the production yield?
You can change the production yield. Yes, definitely. As far as we know on our experience, especially with your red-fruited table varieties, Cardinal, Emperor, Tokay's, we have never been able to achieve the same degree of bright color in those red-fruited varieties on a rootstock as you obtain in the variety on its own roots. On its own roots, for the particular area in which it's adapted, like Tokay's and Lodi or Emperors in the Visalia, Fresno area, they develop that bright red color. And every time you put them on a rootstock, you never achieve that same identical color. You always have problems. Yes?
What happens if you're going to plant on your own roots, domestic stock, and you go out and you propagate from a vineyard that's been grafted? Say, okay, you take Tokay that's been grafted and grown on kind of rootstock. You're planting your vineyard. Now, are you going to get the original good color, or is that those cuttings?
You will get to the original good color on its own roots, unless in grafting onto the rootstock you might have picked up a virus. Now, if you pick up a virus, then you're going to change the whole complex. But presuming that the combination of the Tokay on a rootstock was clean, then it should revert back to the same good color that you had. Yeah. All right, now, let's change the subject.
Once again, what the varieties were.
Pardon?
What varieties?
What varieties? The red-fruited varieties are Cardinal, Tokay, and Emperor are the main ones that are really commercially important. All right, now let's get over to propagation, and primarily grafting. What are our main purposes of grafting? Okay, the first main purpose is you want protection against phylloxera, nematodes. That's the main purpose that we have really in California here. We either have phylloxera in our soil or we have nematodes. So because of these two soil pests, we have to use a rootstock, a suitable rootstock. Now, in Europe, they also have it for protection because of soil type. And I'll give you a good example. In the Champagne region of France, you have high lime. And your rootstocks, like St. George and Riparia, will not grow. They can't hack that. So what they have to use is your Berlandieri hybrids. In other words, we're not necessarily talking about phylloxera here. You're talking about Berlandieri hybrids, and a couple of good ones would be 41B, 420A. SO4, no, it's better in for a cooler climate. Now, this would be A right here, soil type. Now B, you can have wet soils. And for wet soils, there are certain rootstocks. Now we're on Riparia, rupestris hybrids. And two good examples for wet soils are 3309 and 3306. These are two examples where you have wet soil, not necessarily high lime soils. Now we're talking about another soil condition. We're talking about a wet soil. Or over in northern France, we have cool regions. So what do you want? You want a rootstock that has a relatively short growing season, so it'll mature the wood so it can stand the cold winters. You want cold resistance. And in other words, you want a early wood maturity to a rootstock. Get the stuff matured. In other words, get the fruit ripened. So they use a little different one there. They use 5A. Now, they use 5BB. These are Teleki. Teleki 5A. Now 5BB, some people will call it Teleki, others will call it Cobra. We actually call it Cobra here, but it's actually a Teleki hybrid. And they use SO4, which does very well. And these are actually, again, Berlandieri, Riparia hybrid. So in other words, when you have these soil conditions, thanks.
Question.
Yeah.
Back on the phylloxera nematodes, would it be, once the vine is established, the nematodes have no basic, they won't bother the vine that much once the vine is big, strong, and healthy, correct? Once it's established its main root system?
It depends on the rootstock you're using.
Well, the point is, why couldn't you use something like Nemagon and plant your cuttings and use Nemagon for 4 or 5 years? You're still better off trying to worry about making all these cuttings and grafting and this and that.
Fine. In other words, for root knot nematode, then there is a side dressing that you can use, and this is excellent. But what do you do about phylloxera? We haven't got a good control for phylloxera. So we don't have any choice right now. We're a dead duck there. They're working on it, but they have not registered anything yet that we can use on phylloxera. But that's a better way to go, especially if you plant it in a soil that hasn't had anything to start with. It was clean, and then it comes into it. Yeah, you can go this direction.
Do they use these rootstocks in Germany?
Yeah, in other words, these are the ones that they're using in Germany in those cool areas. Now, I can give you something up here. I'll give you 1613 and Harmony, which we consider for nematodes. Nematodes only. And let's say St. George, AXR1 for phylloxera. Yes, we do have we have two rootstocks it reminds me of right here now. We got Salt Creek and Dog Ridge. And these take care of both phylloxera and nematodes. But it goes one further than this. This is excellent for sand piles. In other words, this is a soil condition. We got an excellent rootstock where you got a sand pile. You're talking about Coachella Valley. You're talking about especially Modesto, Livingston area where you have a high sand. These are 1613 cannot hack it, and neither can Harmony. So these two stocks do good. But don't plant them in a rich soil because they're too vigorous and they reduce the set on your crop when you use these in a real rich soil. So in other words, these are for extremely sandy areas. Okay, what's another purpose of grafting? Well, you want to improve your crop. And a good case of this would be, say if you had a weak variety, Petite Syrah, or Zinfandel. They are a weak grower. If you put them on a more vigorous rootstock, you get a bigger vine. I'll give it, in other words, let's say St. George would be a vigorous stock. It would make these grow a heck of a lot better. Ordinarily, if these were on their own roots, you might say in an ordinary soil, they'd be ideal for a head-trained vine because they haven't got that much vigor. You'd have a heck of a time getting them out at an 8-foot spacing on a cordon because they haven't got that much vigor. But you put them on, say, a vigorous stock, and then you do not have the trouble of getting them out there on your cordon. How about changing varieties? You've had Kerrigan growing for years in the vineyard. Not for years. In other words, say you planted with Kerrigan, or say you planted with French Colombard, or say you planted with Palomino. And that they're now becoming, let's say, dogs compared to the Cadillacs, compared to the premium varieties. So if you want to cash in on it, you can graft these over to your premiums and come back within 2 years and be in production again.
If you've got rotten varieties on rootstocks, would it be to your advantage to graft onto the rootstock portion below the union?
No. Once you've got the vine established, I always maintain, don't destroy that nice trunk you have. Unless it's a real young vine, unless it's real small, where you don't have much of a trunk and you can go down and work at ground level, you generally say should get a higher take at ground level. But once you get a nice big vine and you've got your trunk established, then I would always recommend just work below your trellis wire, your lowest wire, and high graft. This is my recommendation. So in other words, you change varieties, and one case here would be where you have a mix in the vineyard, a mix or an off type. That'd be, in other words, 1 or 2 that you want to change over. Or in case your market should change in its preference. In other words, back after Prohibition, well, during Prohibition they were planting Alicante and anything that would produce very heavily, Alicante, Palominos, Carrigans. And then once Prohibition was over, people wanted to go to the better varieties, and you have some of these less desirable ones, then you could graft it over to more desirable varieties because your market preference has changed to better for better wine types. And this is a good case example. This would be during Prohibition when they had these Alicantes or Palominos. They could sell anything. This is what they did. Well, after the people got more accustomed to wine, they weren't satisfied with those varieties. They wanted your Chenin Blancs, they wanted Cabernets, they wanted white Rieslings, they wanted better varieties. So then you'd have a good case here of converting to a better variety because the winery isn't going to pay you for these poorer varieties. And they're going to pay you for blending stock. And then, say you got a new introduction. A new variety comes out. Okay, the best way, your quantity is limited, the best way to get that thing started is, fine, I got a nice acre here of young vines, graft them over, or graft whatever you can, and you build up your wood in a hurry. That's a terrific way to get something in a hurry. The bigger the vine you get and you graft it over, the faster that thing is going to grow, and you can build up your stock, not quite as fast as rapid propagation I'm telling you about. But you can get good wood in a hurry that way. Only one catch. Make sure this thing you use for a rootstock to build it up is clean. Because all you got to do is graft it onto, say, some stocks that are containing leaf roll or one of the viruses, and you've loused up your whole variety. And that's what happened to Ruby Cabernet. That's what happened to Emerald Riesling. And that's what happened to Helena, our new varieties that came out about 10 or 12 years ago. They were put on diseased rootstocks, and they loused up the whole thing, and it took us years to finally get it cleaned up.
What about the age of the vine you're grafting on?
Within limits. In other words, I'd say a vine this size are ideal. I would go up to a vine this size. Now, beyond that, I hesitate. If you can get them to take this size with that tremendous rootstock, those things will just push in a hurry. It's tremendous how fast they push. But it's harder. It's a tremendous shock when you work over a vine this size and chop that top off and say, just put on 2 scions. Because where the scions are growing right below it, that part of your trunk stays alive. Where the scions are not growing, that area where the scions are not located, that tends to die back maybe down about this far. And you got this tremendous root system, and it's only supported by 2 little scions with a few leaves coming out here at a time. So it's a tremendous shock on the vine.
It's a question of the shock then, rather than the vine being too, like when you get old vines and the crop yield is beginning to go down and they're beginning to get old.
No. Once you get that far, it is not worth the trouble and the expense involved and the care it takes for the first couple of years when you graft them over. As far as I'm concerned, it's not worth it. Okay, and we have another purpose of grafting. We don't use it, is for testing. This is in breeding work. New seedlings. In other words, Dr. Olmo has 15,000 new seedlings. Say you had about 60 or 70 nice big vines out here on a cordon, say 3-year-old vines on a cordon. And each arm on the cordon, each branch had 6 spurs from which you were getting 2 shoots. Okay, you could put a seedling, 1 seedling on each one of those spurs. Mark them. In other words, keep track with labels and whatnot, which seedling you got on there. And instead of taking 4 to 5 years for that seedling to bear fruit, within 2 years, on this mature vine now, you T-bud in your seedlings, boom, you've got fruit. You can find out if the seedling's any good or not. So you can cut down your breeding time more than in half by just this little process of budding your seedling stock on these little arms. And it does work. It takes It does take time to bud it in, but it's a quick way of testing seedlings to find out if they're any good. And again, there's another catch. As long as that rootstock is clean, you're all right. But if you're loused up, then you're in trouble. But this is another good reason, or another purpose that we can use for grafting is this hastening of the testing procedure for grapevines. Okay, now I've covered some of this already. I want to just repeat it again. I might say that on the final that you'll be given, most of the questions will come since we had the last midterm. The majority of the questions will come in there. There will be some that'll go back and cover what you've had in your first midterm. So it'll cover everything, but the majority of the emphasis will lie on what you've had since the last midterm. Now, what are the requirements of a good union? Well, first of all, you want something that's where the two combinations are compatible. So in other words, you want to have a good compatible or a long-lived or a long-lasting compatibility. And you want youthfulness. Particularly your scion variety. In other words, when we do our grafting or propagating, we are always using 1-year-old scion wood, 1-year-old bud wood. So we want the youthfulness of your scion. And we're using, say, last season's, in other words, 1-year-old. You want young material. And of course, you all have the opportunity of making bench grafts. You want to have a good contact between your stock and your scion. You know when you made those whip grafts, and occasionally I'd hold it up to the light and I'd say, yeah, you can throw a cat in there. That's not a good combination. You haven't got nice flat surfaces. You don't want any air gaps. You don't want any gaposis when you make whip grafts. And you want to have a good contact, especially when you split and you put your scion in there. If you had a nice, long, gentle taper where you could see a pretty good fit all the way down through your split, that was a heck of a lot better than having a real, abrupt, short taper and just barely touching in 2 spots. So in other words, you want to have as much contact as you can between those 2 surfaces, especially where your cambium is. And it's desirable to have a complete covering of one cut surface on the other. In other words, I told you, especially when we were chip budding, if you can get that chip bud to fit that entire cut that you made, so in other words, there was no overextension of your stock because you had too small a bud, this was the best condition you could have, is a complete fit of that bud in that slot you made. Or if you're making a whip graft, you want to use them both the same size. The more complete contact you can get of your cut surface, the better off. The quicker you're going to get it to heal, the quicker it's going to start to grow, the larger the graft you're going to get at the end of the year. I told you if you could not match the 2 identical, then if you had a bud, you'd fit the bud to one side. Or if you had a whip graft, then you'd have to fit the whip graft to one side. This is not as ideal as when you can make them both fit exactly because they're both the same size. So in other words, try to obtain complete covering of your cut surfaces. And then your timing. In other words, when you do this, In the springtime, it's when the stalk is beginning to grow. And your sign should be dormant. So in other words, in one case, the stalk is beginning to grow, your sign is dormant. This is generally what we feel is the best time to do your grafting. In case of, in other words, your timing and your budding, I told you I went into a whole haranguing on that in the lab. I says, you want your rootstock growing and you want to have mature budwood. So in other words, your timing has to be ideal. And then after you do the operation, you've got to have favorable growth condition. Meaning you got good water. In other words, the ground is not dry. You've got a good temperature. These two are probably the most important. Moisture and temperature. I told you after budding, fine, you can have your rootstock growing, you can have mature budwood, but if you bud in late September and then you catch a rain in the middle of October, you're a dead duck because you haven't had a long enough warm temperature for this to callus in. In the springtime, you're better off. You don't have these problems like they have in the fall. Unfortunately, we haven't had enough time. I don't like going over this quickly. We don't have enough lectures to cover this over a more general time. Take it a little slower. So I'm trying to cover this now. I've got, what, 5 more minutes? Let's look at the types of systems that we have for grafting. Okay. First, when you're using dormant canes as your grafting material, and if your stalk is larger than your scion, for this type we use cleft graft. Or you can use a notch or a wedge graft. You've done this. That's when you're using it. And in this case, your stalks are generally larger. You can use a Bart Graft. Cleft graft, let's say we're going to do it in March. Notch graft, we can do that in March and April. Bart graft, you can't do that until May and June. That comes later. And then chip budding. And ordinarily, this is what we do in August. We do this in the fall and in September. That's when that operation performed. Thank you, Dr. Cook. Now, what if we have the stalk and scion are the same size? Okay, we can do a whip graft. And we can do a short whip. We can do a long whip. You've had the experience. I saw bloodshed. Or we can do machine grafting. And in other words, when I say within reason, they're about the same size. Some might be a little smaller. And the whip grafting is done in March. Machine grafting is done in March. This is all done in the spring. And then we come to number 3 here, where your stalk and scion are growing. Or these are herbaceous. And for that, although it's not used as much, they use a tea bud or they use a green graft. This is done more down in the Fresno area. We do not do it as much up here, but it is done down. Pardon? Oh, right down here, number 3. Thanks, Turnip. Tea bud and greenwood graft, or green graft is what they call it. Green. Now can you see it? All right? Got more time? Oh, gad. Well, I can get started, but I can't go through with it with you too much. I'd like to get into the nursery operations for you. Just stop right here? Okay.
One of the requirements of a good union, we had 6 of them. With this, how about desiccation and drying out?
Well, yeah, I presume that's very important. And I presume that when you do make your union, you make sure it doesn't dry out either by covering it over with moist soil or by covering it over with a tree seal or tree heel. And if you use that compound at high level, then you've got to put some white latex paint on it. Yeah. Paul, I want to see you before you leave.